Welcome to Oratory. Happy Friday, everyone. I have two very special guests this week as we continue our May mental health series, Talk is Tough. I have Stephen Dummit with us today as we have the last few weeks here. And I also have Dr. Hayden Mort. So welcome both of you. Happy Friday and thank you. And we are going to dive right in. So this week, if I can find all of my stuff here, we have a really exciting session for us. And so this week we have Only I Have the Answers,
Yes, stigma lie number three. Only I have the answers.
which I feel like we've got a whole lot to talk about on that one because I feel like that all the time. And then I'm proved over and over again that that's not the case.
Mhm.
But in terms of stigma lies, let's sort of unpack that a little bit, Stephen. What does that really mean?
Yeah. So stigma lie number three, and for those that are listening along, we've been building on stigma lie number one and two, and now we're on number three, being only I have the answers. And what this one really is speaking to is when we're talking about the dynamics of a group and being a leader in a group or being a member of a team and not being in charge, not being the supervisor, not being the foreman, when that leader or foreman believes the lie, the stigma lie, that only they have the answers, what we're doing is we're not allowing everyone else on the team to contribute. So we're not getting a full dynamic range. We're not getting all of the diversity of thought or opinions or creative ideas that a team member or members may have in trying to find the best approach. So when we believe that stigma lie that only I have the answers, we are preventing the best idea from coming to the surface and possibly taking a longer route, a more expensive route, a more dangerous route to get the job accomplished.
I think that I appreciate that you said that and added that like it's a dangerous route because I feel like it's not only dangerous from like a health and safety perspective, it's dangerous from like a mental health perspective, which is also what we're talking about. I think often, as I just admitted, sometimes I feel like I am the only one that can solve my problems. I recognize that sometimes asking for help is actually the answer
Hmm.
and saves me a lot of stress.
Yeah, very much so. And a lot of times that's one of the stigmas. And again, we always I like to define stigma every time I use the term. That's the fear of consequence from an
Yeah.
action or phrase or what we're doing. And if we feel like only I have the answers and I need to ask for help, but I'm afraid to ask for help, and maybe I'm afraid because I'll be thought of as less than or less competent or not the creative one or weaker than or one of these I could fill in 20 more filler words here, if not
Yeah.
200 more filler words. But when we
Yeah.
believe in that, we're not actually doing the more courageous, the stronger, the bolder thing and asking for help and getting that added idea. And as we mentioned before, sometimes it's not idea A or idea B that's the best. It takes both people talking about it to get to idea C that's really the home run for that team or for that decision.
Absolutely. And, I sort of just want to add that we asked Dr. Hayden Moore to be here today because he's done a really cool series here recently with several others talking specifically about men's experiences with mental health and some of how we should be incorporating that a bit more into our dialogue on a routine basis to support the individuals in, specifically heavy industry because I think we talk a lot about um, you know, other people's experiences. I sit in a lot of women's groups and we talk about our specific experiences. And I have found that, as some of our statistics have read, that, we have far more men in the mining and heavy industries than we do women. And they're absolutely struggling significantly at times with admitting that not they only have the answers or with mental health and other things. So Hayden, I kind of want to welcome you into sharing perspectives on this stigma lie specifically.
Yeah, so thank you for that, and I would just back up what Stephen just said 100%. And I think that it is a very male problem actually, and I think having conversations with other men about this, like what is going wrong. It has overlaps with, male toxicity and, in fact, cultural norms of what's expected to be a man. You're expected, there's quite a lot of pressure to provide for the family, to be the breadwinner. And you know what? In fact, I was having a conversation just with my 9-year-old son this morning, because he's having some difficulties. He's like, about not being able to lose a game of chess. He gets all emotional, hyperventilating, right? It's like, can't. So I said, oh, we've all got weaknesses. You have to fail. And he was like, so when do you fail? And I had to challenge myself, because I was like, okay. And I have been thinking about this a lot recently with my mental health posts. And I was like, you know what? As a man, actually, I fail quite frequently to communicate my emotions. We're actually quite suppressed, but that's not the way it should be necessarily. But it's the way society teaches men to deal with their emotions and weaknesses. It's really to bottle it up. It's literally like a bottle of Coke, and you shake it and there's no way out. And you really feel that stress as a man. And unfortunately, what biology tells us is if you suppress any basic instinct, and in this case we're suppressing our parasympathetic pathways, our brain, which is literally our coping mechanism. That's why we cry. It releases oxytocin when we cry, we feel better, but men don't do that. We're not meant to do that, right? But there's a serious consequence, biological consequence that happens if we suppress that, and it comes out in toxic forms. And so, listening to conversation at the beginning, it's like Lindsey, you were saying, well, I think I'm right. At the same time, I'm an academic. I come from a science background. From an academic point of view, I'm very happy about being wrong, about not having all the answers, right? So a good scientist thinks like that. But at the same time, scientists are also close relatives of chimpanzees. So we have this brain which doesn't like being wrong. And men have, on top of that cultural baggage about having to be right all the time. And if you transpose that to mining, which is a very male-dominated, masculine-driven industry, on a mine site in a fly-in, fly-out operation, it gets this cauldron with toxicity which can fester. And so, about me being right all the time, I think that just becomes that much more, pointed in that particular environment. And so I advocate really putting in place a series of interventions which allow that parasympathetic pathway to express itself more fully, that improves workplace outcomes, dynamics, and decision making. Because we just hold up our hands and we invite dialogue, we invite contradiction, and we get a better job done. So it all kind of like links into each other.
Yeah.
That's
I had a thought I was going to throw in there if I could, Lindsey.
please.
I just think it's interesting that, well, one, Hayden, if we had you last week for stigma line number 2, which is you're not allowed to make mistakes, I thought that would have fit perfectly with the story of the losing chess for your 9-year-old son, and well, where do you make mistakes? And when we're talking about only I have the answers, I saw how it quickly the language turned into this idea that I have to be right. And so it was kind of a mix of the two. Whereas stigma line number 2 is that I have to be perfect, I can't make mistakes.
Yeah.
And number 3 is only I have the answers, being that it's more of like a stigma line that's around leadership. Being that if I'm the one in charge, only I have the answers, only I can call the shots, only I can say what is the next step for the team, when the reality is the team are the ones that have the most intimate knowledge of the front line and doing the work. They might know what process would be faster in this application, or where we might have a hang up or a dangerous situation. They actually, in David Marquette language, leadership is language, he would say move power to where the authority is, right? Where the information is. Move authority to where the information is his phrase. Because those that have the information to make that most educated call oftentimes don't have the authority to make the call because they're not in charge. Because the person in charge says, only I have the answers. So kind of distinguishing the two different stigma lies we have there.
Yeah.
Well, and like as we've talked about throughout this series, I feel like obviously these are building on one another, and I think that that's really important to kind of like go back because I can't assume that everybody has watched every single week with us, but I appreciate that you're bringing that up because I think what we're seeing here is it kind of coming full circle, right? If you're actually communicating and working with your team and empowering them, you're creating connection, you're creating a scenario where not only you have the answer and sort of like getting rid of this foundation for ick or where things start to fail and where we all start to sort of just go internal and say like, I'm stuck in this pattern of behavior, I'm stuck in feeling this specific way, I'm alone, I can or can't do it, or whatever that turns into for people, and that tends to be very, very isolating and really affect their performance and mental well-being, etc. And so I appreciate that, like, one, we have a really great real life example where Hayden, you're being vulnerable with your son and saying like, okay, this is where I've failed, and teaching him that it's okay to have these emotions, but also Stephen saying like, hey, if we actually incorporated individuals that were doing this work, that we would have better answers as leaders, and so therefore we're not alone. We don't always have the right answers just ourselves, and so thank you for making this happen in 5 minutes of our conversation today. That was the Cliff Notes version, but now we get to dive a little deeper. So, I think it's really, really important because I talk to so many people on a routine basis, specifically leaders, that say, this is really hard.
Mhm.
I don't know that I'm cut out for this. And by the time they're contacting me and saying I need out of a role or I don't know what to do in this role, I can only assume that that weight is pretty significant on their shoulders. And so Hayden, you just mentioned like there's some frameworks that you can put into play that might be useful in these circumstances. Can we kind of talk a little bit about that?
Well, I was talking about it from a mental health standpoint, but
Yeah.
I realized in my first monologue there, I didn't address like the leadership implications, which Stephen then alluded to. But and I think before I go into those interventions that I mentioned, I'll just like touch on that, which is essentially I would suggest if we're talking about leadership and talking about being vulnerable, it's very KPI driven in the mining industry. I mean, everything is KPI, KPI, KPI. All you need to do, in my opinion, is to look at great leadership and examples. It could be famous examples. It could be Abraham Lincoln. It could be the Obama administration, where they all say, if somebody, I want a room packed with people who disagree with me, right? Especially if they disagree with me, because that diversity, first of all, it removes a weight off the leadership's shoulder to actually delegate that responsibility. It's like, this is a collective decision, I don't know. That ability to say, I don't know, it's quite liberating, to be honest with you. Okay, they're the decision maker, but they're the aggregate. They have to pull the strings together. That's why they are there. And so having that ability and openness to say, I don't know, that's that's a relief. I promise, that's a huge relief. And it ends up the decisions being more solid, more founded in science and in engineering. I don't know if Steve wants to come in for this. We could talk about the mental health interventions to make men better, but I think that maybe that's a slightly different topic.
I think I think the two play one into the other.
Yeah.
I'm a huge advocate for mental health and my experiences in construction trades, which are very akin to the mining. And really, the approach and why we bring up the stigma lies is by believing any of these four stigma lies. It is a leadership based concept, but what it's doing is it's preventing connection of a team. It's preventing communication and connection from happening. And the stance that I take is that the more communication we have, the more communication tools we have, the better connection we can create between our team members, the more resilient that team becomes, the better that team becomes at handling stress, And when we've lowered our stress, we've effectively improved our mental health. So I do think it's very well tied to mental health. And if we have that leader that thinks only I have the answers and they're not getting everyone from the team, what is the experience of the rest of the team members? And if they're being shut down and like you're saying, they're bottling up the parasympathetic emotions and the emotional reactions and wanting to contribute to that conversation and get to the best answer, but they're being shut down, that's not leading to a better experience at work. So it's more stress, which will be lower mental health. So I think they're very heavily intertwined.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that it comes to both directions, top down, bottom up. I mean, there's a whole cultural thing there, but the leader sets the culture, and if people don't feel heard, Lindsey, we talked about the talent pipeline quite a lot this week, but if this is a ubiquitous problem in the mining sector, and the mining sector is worried about turnover, then it really makes financial sense. They're always harping on about, oh, no, talent. Well, allow people to express themselves. Train your leaders to be to use empathy as a tool to enhance productivity, and you will get a higher retention of your staff and better outcomes. And so that kind of leads on to the interventions. I mean, okay, better work-life balance, having people have an on-site psychologist, for example. That's a really drop in the ocean for a mining company, I believe. Having a stable internet connection, having a stipend to actually put a good internet connection at the home of the person so they can stay in touch with their family, for example. There's a bunch of stuff which, if we're talking about male toxicity, need to be done in order for men to actually be able to express their emotions, not just in the workplace, but outside the workplace, and have that connection with their home. That's going to just stimulate the parasympathetic pathways way more, and it's going to be better for women. These are going to help men help women become a more equal work environment. So it's all about workplace safety too.
Yeah.
So decision making, safety, mental health. It makes good financial sense. This is not wishy-washy stuff. Talent pipeline is so important to get this stuff right. And I just wish the male executives would listen and understand the biology and why it feeds into the bottom line of their operation. That's what they really care about at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And I actually had a conversation earlier today that I think is a great example of somebody who probably is leading with empathy and understanding some of the experience, and not assuming that they have all the answers, while also supporting a female employee that was experiencing burnout and was thinking of changing jobs. And so I'm going to briefly share a story as anonymously as I possibly can, because it stood out for me. And I often get one end of the spectrum or the other, and this one was sort of like a very happy scenario. And so I spoke to somebody earlier today, and they said, listen, I thought that I wanted a new job because I had several projects. They did not go as expected. I really felt like a failure. I was getting into my head about it, and I thought, well, I just have to leave this organization because I'm not adding value, and felt really badly about it. And so started actively looking for roles. Ultimately decided to go to their boss and said, look, we've rendered a few things that did not turn out well, and I'm feeling compromised and burnt out, and I don't know what to do. And I also think that I'm maybe not cut out for this, and I should contribute in different areas or leave. And the manager said, whoa, I had no idea, and I want to keep you. You're absolutely adding value, and if you're hungry for areas in this area, then let's layer that in and perhaps subtract some of the areas that are burdening you or bogging you down or not making you feel great. And so tried to fill this person's cup and say hey, you're doing great. I understand. how you might be feeling and why you might be feeling this way. Let's come up with a solution. You're valuable to me. Let's keep you. Ultimately, this gave the person the opportunity to do great work, to be reinvigorated, committed to the organization, empowered to express themselves and have these kinds of feelings and know that they would be supported. And I was like, this is the best story I've heard all week. Because so often that's not the case, male, female, etc. We're not seeing that, and we're assuming we have to have the answer and letting this really like subtract from our experience. And then as leaders, we're saying, oh, they didn't perform, well, on to the next. And if we're talking about a pipeline problem, or we're talking about a retention problem, all of this roots right into it. And so having the ability to have these difficult conversations, vulnerable conversations, is so, so important. So I don't know where I've left us, but you guys chime in as you would.
I for one totally agree that having the conversations is of utmost importance.
Talk is tough.
But talk is tough, and that's why communication tools and skill sets are super important. They're of paramount importance. And as Hayden was referencing, for companies to lean in and look at what is the actual ROI on training and investment, and what do you get against your bottom line, when you improve a communication skill set that speaks directly to the situation you just described, is having the courage and the vocabulary and the tact and empathy to go have that conversation, or if you're a leader, to receive that conversation and say, I'm not best utilizing your skill sets, or I had no idea this was happening. Thank you for communicating that. How do I now set you up for success to be a more productive, a more at peace employee that has a better work experience, and they're gonna be more effective, they're gonna produce more, they're gonna be happier. That's better mental health in a nutshell.
Yeah.
And that came through communication skills.
Yeah.
This is actually one of the things that I always did, public facing outreach and that kind of stuff. That was one of my first course. But when I started doing mining communication, everyone was like saying, you have to do internal communication. And I was like, okay, this is a different world for me. So I started to have conversations with, junior geologists and mining engineers and all that kind of stuff. And very quickly, I was hearing horror stories sometimes of communication failures which were costing tens of millions of dollars. In this case, Australian, so it was a major in Australia, and this junior geologist was wanting to prove themselves a little bit, but they were wanted to go to their site manager on site and saying, I've been looking at the tailings here, and we're actually throwing pretty good ore out here, and I've done some back of the envelope calculations, and it seems to be around about $3 million, $5 million worth of ore a week. And the person, this was a female geologist, the manager was saying, okay, it's good, do your job. Now this is oh, okay, maybe a mining manager doesn't care about $5 million a week. I wish. But this was what happened to that geologist? She left. She didn't go back. She just left the industry. Very competent geologist. And then the mining industry stands up and says, we can't get enough people. Well, this is just one example of where it goes wrong. So I had to come up very quickly with empathy, up and down the chain of command. How do you speak? How do you couch what you need to say in ways which will emotionally resonate with the people who you want to speak to, whether that's downwards or upwards? It's such an important skill set which affects the bottom line.
Yeah. It really does. And, I think sometimes we toss around the idea of empathy, and people just immediately say how do we train for empathy? I think that, Stephen, you and I have talked a lot about just foundational communication skills, but training empathetic foundational communication skills. Where do we start? How do we give people the opportunity to learn empathy?
In my experience, it is practice. It is hands-on practice. And we kind of talked about communication skills, and Hayden, so I made a reference that I said it's my belief that most people have kind of secured their communication tool set, if you will, and locked it in pretty much by the time that they're age 10 or 12 years old in terms of the foundation of how they're going to communicate. And so typically we're learning that generationally from father figures, parental figures, mentor figures that are raising us. When we lean in, you can and improve those skill sets, and they can improve just like playing any kind of sport or any profession where an amount of hours put in and study doing the work will produce a better result. When it comes to empathy, I think it takes practice in actual conversations. It's not something you could just read about in a book and think your way into being more empathetic. I think you have to put it into practice. I think you need to stumble with it a little bit and realize, oh, I really messed that one up. I didn't lead with empathy there, and I see the result. That's going to allow us to make that mistake and learn from that mistake. So I think if there's a practical application in learning to lead with more empathy.
Can I just say, is it just as we were saying that, and then I just reached for a book, and then you said you can't learn it in a book. And I was like,
here's the book.
Not just the book alone. You can reference the book and put it in. I think it takes the practice of what you read for it to start to make a behavior change.
And this is, okay, so this is the book. You've probably seen it before. It's a very famous book here, and it's an awesome book. You know, I closed a $10,000 contract just by reading the preface of this. That's, I mean, seriously, but putting it into practice. So it is, as Stephen said, it's about putting it into practice. And it just shows that it has financial implications. But, you know, the stuff that Chris Voss teaches, and it's called tactical strategic empathy, and he says it's this mental manipulation. This is just emotional intelligence on steroids, essentially. You're really aligning yourself with the person. And that's a good, and you can do that in a business or in a family setting or with your children, right? It doesn't matter. You are empathizing. That's all you're doing. And then stuff that doesn't seem intuitive, like Stephen, you said something about the way we argue or the way we discuss, or essentially fixed in pre-adolescent time at 10 years old. Albert Einstein said something similar. He said common sense is a collection of prejudices that we acquire by age 16. But it requires us to kind of erode that a little bit, to push back just a little bit. And so the stuff that I learned from this book, and I learned along my career in communication and neuroscience, is that there are things that society teaches us are counterintuitive. For example, always looking for a yes answer all the time, just close an agreement or to get agreement. That's the wrong way to get an agreement. In fact, the best way, according to Chris Voss and FBI negotiators like that, is to actually look for no, is to actually look for disagreement, and to allow people that psychological safety net to refuse. And then you align yourself with them and you become their allies, and then suddenly you move forward together. And that question of co-collaboration. There's so many little things there which, when you read it, it seems like, of course, why wouldn't I think about that before? But that's exactly what Stephen said. That's why training is so important. But not just training, providing a stepping stone pathway. How do you implement that within your own workflow? And then it becomes transformative.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I think, Stephen, you know, to leap off of that, I feel like, you know, in your practice and when you're working and coaching with individuals at companies or coaching companies on how to do this better, you know, how do you at this point give them the opportunity to take some of these ideas of empathy and of, you know, not having to do it yourself all of the time or know all the answers? How do you train that out of them or give them the opportunity to kind of like move forward from here?
Introduce possibility, if I had to put it in a nutshell.
Yeah.
When doing the training, again, it could be a lot of different formats, but I like to do training where we're doing 4-hour sessions, workshops, or multiple workshops in a row, where you can present an idea, and it could be a Chris Voss idea. I'm super excited you brought up Never Split the Difference. It's got 2 copies behind me on the bookshelf. Love the book. And I think a lot of it comes down to putting it into practice in the present moment. And a lot of the things that Chris Voss talks about, requires you to be absolutely present in the moment and not have a predetermined answer. Like, for example, a communication tool, active listening, is not forming an answer until the other person is done speaking. Where often we listen for the first thing that we say, aha, I have the answer to that. And then we just sit there with that answer and we wait our turn. We wait for them to take a breath, have any kind of break to say that I have an answer to one thing that you said. I'm no longer being present the moment I predetermined my answer. So I'm not paying attention to the conversation, looking for a disagreement, looking for the body language, somebody leaning back when I said a certain thing, nervousness, maybe they start to fidget a little bit or twisting in their chair or whatever the signs are. We're not paying attention. Our awareness has evaporated once we have the answer.
Yeah.
So staying present and trying to refrain and continue to take in information is part of that skill set. And so putting people into a group conversation or a one-on-one conversation, one of them that we do, for example, is just about open-ended questions, right? The practice is two partners, and the goal is one partner is their role is to ask open-ended questions only, and the other person just answers. And the goal is for the person asking the questions to see if they can carry the conversation for 2 minutes, only asking open-ended questions. So no yes or no questions, no simple one-word answer questions. And in that 2 minutes, I find people that have worked together for 5, 6, 8 years discover something that they've never shared before, that maybe they had a thing about hunting, or they went to the same alma mater, or they grew up in two towns that were 10 miles apart, but maybe a year or two apart. Oh, how did we not run into each other? That discovery process introduces that it's possible, even in this 2-minute drill in a workshop, to maybe learn something more or communicate in a different way. And that starts that understanding of another person is a layer of empathy and saying, hey, maybe I just judged that person quick. I didn't realize that they were in pain or had this prior injury or this thing going on or this problem with the health member of the family. And suddenly we have more empathy now because we actually asked a few questions and listened to the answers. That discovery process, then it allows empathy to come to the surface.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that you just sort of went through that, because I think that active listening is so important. And I think so much of the time, as you said, if a presentation is going on and there's words behind, all of a sudden people are tuned out and looking at the words. But, also if you're asking for participation or something's going on and you're like, me, I have the answer. And all of a sudden you stop paying attention. But I was listening to a podcast, Simon Sinek has the Bit of Optimism podcast, and he interviewed, I think, the CEO of the Chicago Bears football team. And something about this ultimately was creating an awestruck moment or something. I think that's the wrong word, but ultimately he loves the CEO of the Chicago Bears likes creating that moment where people are like, oh, a bird, a shooting star, whatever, right? And he said the only reason that happens, that he can create those kinds of experiences by building stadiums, by onboarding people appropriately to his team, is by being empathetic, having these kinds of conversations and asking very open-ended questions and saying what gets you excited? Or, hey, rather than just coming to interview, bring your whole family to interview. This is an entire experience. And so not only is it empathy, it's literally being subject to responding rather than having all of the answers, which then is saying, as a CEO of a massive football organization, not only I have the answers, you're giving me the answers and empowering them to have them and creating this ongoing dialogue and stream of just cool stuff that happens. And so I listened to this, I think, on the airplane yesterday coming home. But I was really impressed that he would do such a thing, and that basically he gave us the same playbook. So, and Chris Voss is doing all of this as well.
Yeah, it's really powerful stuff, and it really makes a huge difference to the workplace. I mean, essentially what it does, I mean, you mentioned the family there, but essentially what all of these things, that example, and Stephen was saying, it's everything is deactivating the parts of the brain which cause fight or flight. It's activating parts of the brain which are associated with fairness to decrease power asymmetry. And so you know, he starts with suggesting you do an accusation audit. I don't know if you could read the book to find out what all this stuff means, but that's if you're having a difficult conversation, you might want to do an accusation audit to try and decrease the tension, to like say, you're not going to be happy with me, or you're going to hate me for this. It frames it, and someone's bound to think way worse than it really is, and so you come in and hit them with it, it's actually not so bad. So you're framing it, and then is the active listening that we were just talking about. And then afterwards he goes through labeling. What did you just hear? So you prove to the person you actually listened to them, and then you might throw back. It sounds like you feel like this, or it feels like you're not like this. And then they might say, no, 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 that's not right. And you say, I didn't say it is. I'm just saying that's what it sounds like, right? So you're kind of protecting yourself a little bit. And then you invite them to say no. So you actually ask a question in the negative, and then they'll actually know, and it gives you that safety. And so there's a whole bunch of things. What you're doing the whole time is building up empathy, building up trust. It's the trust, which is a much more important commodity than any mine has. It's trust. That's it. And so how do you build that trust to make your workforce effective? That's what
Yeah. So interesting. So as I'm looking at my notes for our episode today, so we have like the stigma lie, and then we have like the cures, right? And so for today, we have sort of like asking others for input as a stigma cure. Ask others for input before offering your own ideas, and that again, it's just as you said, gives them the opportunity to say no or yes or agree, or for you to listen and figure out then what to do with it. And so, again, I think it's fascinating to see so many examples of how we can do this in real time, right? And use it. But I think the practical applications of this are not just at work, they're in every facet of our life. And so for the fact that we can practice it in every facet of our lives means that we have the opportunity to get pretty good at this if we actually try.
Absolutely. That's one of my main arguments for investing in communication skills training of any kind, because it's applicable everywhere. And so
Yeah.
if we're talking about, you brought up the cure for stigma line number three, right? That only I have the answers. And that's one of the leadership skills, communication skills. When you want to get the most ideas out of your team, if you present your idea first, oftentimes you've just shut down their ideas and they'll just parrot something that's in alignment with your idea. Whereas if you just had a very similar conversation, but you said, hey team, I'd love to get all your ideas on this project. We need to get a new creative idea moving forward. And then don't say anything as the leader. And then it's an open forum for people to then give all of their ideas without any kind of container or bumper lanes or anything. And then you can add your idea then. That's interesting. Thank you for all the input. When I came in this room, my idea was going to be this, but now I've just heard these things. Now everyone is contributing to the conversation, and it really lets them matter as a whole human. It brings up the idea of blue work and red work. And red work is just the physical work that we do. Blue work are the thinkers. And oftentimes in mining, extraction, and construction, we delineate blue workers and
Yeah.
red workers. But when you go into a situation and said, I want everyone to be a blue worker right now. I want all the ideas to come in. I now get to balance out my amount of red work and blue work. And I feel like I have more purpose on the team.
Yeah. Hayden, you want to take anything there?
I was momentarily distracted as my 12-year-old just came in the room, but no, I don't have anything to add to what Stephen just said. I mean, I think he's got a lot more on-the-ground experience with training mining teams. Mine's mostly theory, but I just see, as I said, so many different overlaps. And I guess I think I would want to add one thing, and that is all these, of course, empathy is used in our day-by-day lives. It's probably the most transferable skill. And we talk about communication. I include empathy in communication because communication is half of communication should be listening, and that means empathizing. And so I just think to really shift the culture, it has to be a cultural shift in mining for this to actually mean anything.
Yeah.
it won't just improve people's lives on the mine site and in the companies, but also at their homes too, because that's how transferable it is. Learning empathy skills has greatly enhanced my relationship with my wife, for example. It's just everything's much more fluid. So, yeah, happy people, happy business.
I love that. I think, again, just to kind of tie it into what I'm seeing, and I guess ask potentially a hard question to answer so that individuals who might be listening say, like, okay, now I have a new tool. So just framing it a little bit there. When, like, I often wind up with people saying, I share ideas and they're not received, right? So if they're lower in the totem pole and they've gone and they've solved a problem or they've come up with a new idea, just as you said earlier about the geologist that then left, when they're not receiving information from somebody at a lower demographic, that person is inclined to leave. How can we give them tools so that, one, they can protect themselves from thinking like, okay, I'm not I'm worthless. I don't have the ability to convey my thoughts or ideas, or I have to leave or whatever. How can we retain them and protect their feelings and mental health and coach them into, something else? How do we help them?
Okay. Hayden, do you want to go for it?
Yeah, I can. Give you some more time to prepare for that.
I told you it was going to be a doozy of a question.
No, I mean, okay, no. I mean, so one way we could do it is by actually training them to. So that is actually when I first started my online training course back in 2000 for all geoscientists. Right, it's a different question, but the first adopters of that were mining professionals, and in fact, people working on mine sites. So this, I'm talking about like November 2020. So that's the beginning of the pandemic. They were saying, we need something for the mining industry. We need training for the mining industry because I don't know how to speak to those higher up. It's like banging my head against a brick wall. And so, first of all, teaching them to communicate is going to enhance their employability. So if they do leave, then they should feel more confident they're going to be accepted somewhere else because someone's going to value that great communication skill. That should give them a little bit of security. Second, teaching them, training them to communicate in a way which resonates with a specific area of the hierarchy. So understanding it's in some ways researching what someone cares about and what their deliverables are and what their KPIs are. That is in some ways theoretical empathy. So you're actually empathizing with that person's situation. How do you piggyback onto that and couch what you want to say in that reality of that person you want to target for communication? So it's the site manager who's being arrogant. Okay, what's the site manager's KPIs? What's his personal situation right now? Is he going through a hard time? You're empathizing with that person, and so then how can you actually, if you write a huge email to that person, doing all your calculations, it's probably going to hit delete. It's probably going to be like, I can't be bothered with this, I don't have time. But if you understand the pressures that person is under, then you can adapt what you say. And now with AI, it's even easier to adapt. But you have to do it in your own voice, of course. You can actually improve the chances that you get a positive response and feel valued. So learning communication skills will make you feel valued, more likely by those higher above you, but certainly by those outside the industry, which gives you that confidence.
Okay. No, I think that's really important.
Yeah, I would add to that a layer of learning to speak with some curiosity. This geoscientist in the example that we're giving saw that there was $3 to $5 million a week going of ore being wasted, and if that is presented as a statement of fact and not as I've discovered this, I'm wondering what we can do with this or how we can produce this into something else, we're adding a layer of curiosity, a question to it. And so it's kind of the old adage of don't just state a problem, offer a solution. It might not be the end solution that we run with, but if we're just stating this much is getting wasted, now that site manager says, okay, now I have to do this much more. I have to do this added layer of thing.
Yeah.
So my workload goes up. And so that person is then not being very empathetic to the site manager, kind of as Hayden is mentioning here. But saying, hey, I've noticed this. What I thought a possible solution is if we could do this and get this team involved. You've now pretty much figured it out. The site manager merely has to approve it and maybe oversee some things, but doesn't have to then take on this new burden of refining all this material and what are we doing with all this. So learning to frame how to get what you want out of people. It is in some form manipulation, as Chris Voss says, but it's emotional intelligence. How can I speak to the site manager in a way to bring up the idea, ask a few questions, and then maybe ask, is this something you think that I could take on, and not make it a burden to them?
Yeah.
And potentially also try to understand what other pressures or stress or load are they taking on, and are you presenting it at the right time? Or is it in the middle of, if Thursday afternoons is the biggest crunch time where they have to make the heaviest decision before a Friday and the weekend, maybe don't bring it up on the Thursday afternoon. Can you calculate when that site manager might be in the best, most relaxed, most receptive environment to hear a new idea?
Yeah, it's all empathy. And you probably heard that really famous example of, how judges are less likely to be lenient the closer they get to lunchtime, because they just get hungry and more grouchy.
So bring them a snack.
Thing. I mean, to hell with the justice system is screwed if that's. But like that is empathy. So you're like all of these like practical little like actionable things. It's all empathy. It's not just being touchy-feely. It's like, okay, I want to get what I want. How do I understand this person better? So,
Several years ago, real world example, my husband is an engineer and he does deep dives, like real deep dives, and he needs quiet space and all these things. And I've talked to people all day and I've brainstormed ideas, and I'm like, I think it's height of COVID and everybody's at home, and I was like, whatever my idea was needed to be expressed in that moment. A little ADHD doesn't help with that either. But I run upstairs and I'm like, Casey, I have to, and he's like, in the midst of whatever experimental craziness deep dive he's in, and it regardless of how good my idea was going to be, I wasn't going to get the validation that I needed to be able to get it off my chest or have somebody else tell me that it was great or whatever I needed at that moment. And it was literally that very real world moment that then, before I go into his office or broach any topic with him in a personal, professional, whatever capacity, I say, do you have time for X, Y, and Z at the moment? Is there space, right? Because he needs that, but I also need what I'm going to get from him. And even doing that before I have a hard conversation with a client or in anything, I've just transitioned this into all of the stuff. Just sort of say hey, do you have space for this right now? Getting that buy-in already gets you into a space where they're going to be a bit more receptive, I think, to whatever it might be that you're coming up with. I think if you say hey, can I talk? You might cause somebody a whole lot of anxiety. I love getting the message hey, let's schedule a quick meeting about whatever, or it's good, or what, something like that, where you can kind of give somebody an inkling of what they might be getting themselves into with you. But asking for people's time is a really important lesson that I've certainly learned.
So Chris Voss would tweak that just a little bit, Lindsay.
Yeah.
He would say, he's like a god. He's coming in for we should have him on. Invite him on. He would say, instead of saying, do you have time, put it in the negative. So you're inviting a no. He would say, I don't suppose you have time, right? Okay. You see how it's it's slightly different. So you're actually telling the person, I assume you don't have time for me, right?
Yeah.
They're actually inviting them to say no, and it's okay for you to say no, because I've just said that you probably don't have time. But at the same time, because you're giving them that safety net, they feel obliged to say, but I can do it in 10 minutes, or it appeals to their contrarian nature, because we all have that contrarian nature, right?
Yeah.
We want to disagree with people. I guess we're stubborn like that. And they say, no, I have time for you. What do you want? So then you can take advantage and say, let's do it.
Yeah.
But you're given them that safety net. So invite no. It's actually really powerful.
I love that. Um, I just, there's so many little things that we can do. And I think the part that I would like to remind people of, as we're already at 50 minutes into our conversation, so we've got like a good 10 minutes left, is that, by not assuming that you have all the answers, by not assuming that you're alone, by inviting the opportunity to connect with others, which is sort of like where we continue to add on to these building blocks through this series of mental health, is sort of just saying, like, it's okay if you don't know. And sometimes we just purely have to have the permission to say, I don't have all the answers. Somebody help me out.
There's a there's power in saying I don't know, and
Yeah.
that power is actually for a lot of other people. It makes you seem more human. It takes you off of a pedestal. As a leader, if you in front of your team, I'm not recommending do it all the time, but
Yeah.
if you have the ability to say I don't have the answer here, I'm going to figure it out. I don't have the answer, team, let's dive in and figure this out. You're relating to them. You're connecting to them on a human level and not just being this machine that always has the answers.
Yeah.
So it's okay. So other people, it's okay not to have all the answers all the time. It's okay to say I don't know.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about, I want to bring this in. You talk about the building blocks of what we've kind of been doing with the podcast so far, and I want to make sure I point out that for stigma line number 3, only I have the answers. What it's touching on is what we call contributor safety. So we talked a lot about empathy and trust today. And so in Timothy Clark's words, it's psychological safety is broken down into 4 steps. And step number 1 is inclusion safety. Step number 2 is then learner safety. And step number 3 is what he calls contributor safety. And that is, do I feel safe enough to contribute a potential idea or thought or way of doing things to this group without a fear of consequence, without the stigma to it? That is how we actually achieve psychological safety. That's how we actually start building trust on our teams. And the more trust we're building on our teams, the more connected that team is going to be, the more effective, the more productive, the more safe, the better experience you have with that team every day. And again, these same principles you just take home. We
Mm-hmm.
gave an example a few minutes ago about a leader saying, I'm looking for a new idea and not giving the idea first. What if you just did that in a family context, or ask your kids for some ideas before you give your idea? The principle applies still. So we're always trying to build on this. How do we create psychological safety, the big fancy word for trust? And so it starts with including people. Next is the willingness to make mistakes so we can help, so we can learn. And the third step, and we'll get to the fourth one next week, but the third step is, can I safely contribute an idea to the group? Even if it's a bad idea, even if it's not the idea we're going to run with, will the group accept me for being a contributor? And
Yeah.
that's what starts to build trust and cohesion and connection on the team.
I appreciate that you brought up, like, the fact that psychological safety is just a big word for trust. Because I think sometimes we're met with resistance when we toss around these different concepts and ideas to senior leadership in some circumstances, and like, oh, everything's been fine without this forever. Like, what is this big push about? Whatever initiative it might be, ESG, DEI, psychological safety, all of that stuff, right? Like, it gets played out over time. But if we put this to a word where it resonates with all of us at any level and in any role, do you trust the people that you're working with?
Yeah, yeah.
That's like
You
exactly
know,
where we need to start.
I think when we talk and preach about this, I hope there's some senior leadership listening, watching this, but we have to be mindful and empathize with them and the way we speak about it, because
Yeah.
again, and that's why I keep bringing up words like KPI and bottom line, because unfortunately, mining companies are listed on stock exchanges, and there's only really one thing that they really care about, and that's the direction of the ticker price. It's going up or down. If it's going down, the CEO could be out by his or her ear. So, um,
Yeah.
if that is how myopic they are, and unfortunately they're legally obliged to their shareholders. And we need to kind of like explain why trust matters to their
All of those.
their capitalization, right?
Yeah.
And so, and sometimes that's a little of a leap, right? But we have to make it as simple as possible for them to understand. Give them a little stepping stones across a river. This will result in more productivity and your stock price going up. You will be faced by fewer lawsuits, your turnover will go down, your diversity will improve. 76% of a company's reputation, 76% of a company's market capitalization is down to reputation, which is incredible. So, get this right. This is big money. Think
Yeah.
greedy eyes. Think big dollar eyes. This is important for your company, and it starts with happy employees. Trust.
I couldn't agree more. And I was just at a conference this week and had a small panel, and we talked a lot about sort of the human elements of doing work better, differently, and the value that it adds. And ultimately, that's the why, right? And soapbox moment for me that isn't new to anybody that might be listening is that ultimately, if we don't create organizations that think about their people and what those people want to add value to and create the organization around that, then like there is no why. There is no productivity. There isn't a reason to invest in it. Like it doesn't go very far. We've seen great ideas with poor leadership fail over and over and over again. And the mining industry, quite frankly, we don't have the time left to do that. We have a lot of constraints put on us at this point, and if we don't have a more compelling why and treat people like people, we won't get those things accomplished, and it's never been more pressing. So there's my soapbox in an abbreviated fashion. Thanks for listening to me. But with 3 minutes or so left on our ticker here as we advance, I do want to preface that we have one more episode before the end of the month, and so we have moving forward, we have "I am right" as the stigma lie, and so we'll go into that next Friday as well. Thursday, Friday. Stephen, you're my timekeeper.
Next Thursday.
Next
Yes.
Thursday.
This is the Friday episode.
Next Thursday, we will do that at 3 p.m. Mountain Time again. And I'm looking forward to it. So that will be the conclusion of our mental health month. But, I want to give you guys the opportunity to kind of go out with closing notes, both with regards to this key stigma lie as well as men's mental health. And, then we'll kind of close out from there.
Well, I think on my end, I want to echo what Hayden was just saying about making a case for the upper level, the business owners that need to appease the shareholders, and that there's absolutely a case for trust affecting the bottom line of companies and how productive and how much money they can produce, how effective they are as a company. And trust is a huge factor in that one. And the more that we're building trust and creating a better experience on our teams, it starts with a team of 8, 10, 15, and there's a ripple effect that goes out that does change the culture of the whole company. And so if 76%, whatever the stat was you gave there, Hayden, about of a company's there is based on their reputation, let's start affecting their reputation by people wanting to talk about how excited they are that I work for X company. Mm-hmm. And that's based on the experience they have at work and how much they're being invested in. And I just go back to a phrase that I always believe in is that people believe in a company that invests in them. If you invest in your people, they invest in you.
Yeah. I used to close out. I mean, I talked about the market capitalization and why that's their ultimate KPI and how it's so important. But you just said, Stephen, something that I kind of said in my training, which was, I said, your employees are your greatest ambassadors. And so that essentially is the ultimate value that they bring. And so by teaching everybody in mining companies these essential, they're not soft skills, critical empathy skills, you are going to increase the value of your company.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that's a great way of sort of like capping it off. But I also have to just acknowledge that I get to have these two wonderful contributors in December as part of like a 1 day panel that we're getting to do. And so, like, this is my teaser. And so, I've got both of you here today talking about things that I think are really, really important. And so I'm very, very excited to do that over a more lengthy time frame that we can try to impact what we're aiming for and get companies to really pay attention to the people as their assets and do the right things moving forward. So I very much appreciate both of you and your time and your perspectives and just investing into this series. So with that, we of course all will be receptive and responsive to any comments that are left behind, any reach outs that you might want to do personally or on our comments feed on this. So this is on live and all kinds of other places, but we will share links to everybody's respective websites and details from here. So happy Friday, and in the US, happy Memorial Day on Monday. And thank you so much all for being here, and thank you guys for contributing today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having us.
Awesome. Talk soon.